President Donald Trump made a triumphant return to Capitol Hill last Thursday. It was his first time meeting with lawmakers since the January 6, 2021 attacks. Orrin McIntyre is author of The Total State: How Liberal Democracies Become Tyrannies. Joining me now with more. Orrin, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's talk about this. You have this enthusiastic greeting. It was near his birthday, so it was a whooping good time. I believe there was even cake. I couldn't believe that it's been 3 years since President Trump's been there in the same spot.
Yeah, obviously, with the situation around the former president and his run for office and everything the Democrats are trying to do to push him out of his ability to actually have a real campaign, it's important for the establishment Republicans, those that are already in Hill, to show that they do support him. They understand that he will be the nominee and that they're not going to let the attempts of the left to go ahead and besmirch his reputation, call him a felon, throw all these insults at him. They're not going to let that make them waver in their support for the president.
So, Orrin, what do you think of our chances are that they'll actually congeal together? And if they take back the House and the Senate, that they'll support the legislative agenda of former President Trump, who would then he'd be President Trump again. He would have a legislative agenda that has to do with implementing immigration reform, repealing the ACA, and possibly some foreign policy initiatives that would need congressional approval. And the first 2 years of his first term, the Republicans were unable to get it together to make that happen.
Yeah, honestly, I never put it beyond the current Republican House and congressmen and senators to betray the American people. They've done this over and over again. They've fallen short on a regular basis. I think it's critical that Donald Trump focus on his authority through the administration. Of course, he'll need congressional approval for much of what he needs to do. But what we know from his previous presidency is he was defeated so often by the eternal bureaucracy, the deep state, as many people call it. And so the real focus has to be his transition, getting in there, cleaning out these bureaucracies, using Schedule F and the other legal strategies that he now has in place to staff these places with bureaucrats that are going to make things work for him. Obviously, he'll also need to make these connections with the legislators. They'll need to be pressured by their constituents to go ahead and follow his plans. But ultimately, I think the real crux is going to be whether or not he can get the executive branch itself to behave in his interest.
Yeah. So you could not have put it better. Orrin, the issue that we have is the administrative state, but he gets to bring in around 4,000 people to replace people who are currently working because they're appointees. And the last administration, obviously, he was a new politician. His win of the nomination was a little unexpected by some of the kind of longstanding organizations. In preparation this time, we've seen the Heritage Foundation launch their um, 2025 project, which is applications from around the country and some even internationally for people who feel they have skills that might work in an incoming Trump administration. And they have now interviewed and vetted thousands of candidates for those roles. So I feel like they're better prepared. Will that help?
Absolutely. As I explained in my book, The Total State, really what we've seen is a capture of the government by a managerial class that has its own issues, its own agenda, its own incentives and priorities that often don't involve the well being of the American people. Originally, when Donald Trump came into office, he did not have personnel that were loyal to him because so much of the managerial class, even those that call themselves conservatives or Republicans, are captured by the priorities of those in that class. He needs people from outside the system, but people who still have the expertise to make the system work. And that's a very difficult thing to do. He didn't have that the first time around. He didn't have that in place. But hopefully, this new architecture that he will have with the Heritage Foundation, with Project 2025, will allow him to go ahead and clear out those that were slowing down his agenda, those that were actively sabotaging what he was trying to do, and replace them with people from outside the system who will still be able to go ahead and put into place the changes he wants to make on things like immigration.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. So let's talk about some of the things that would be first priorities. If you were advising him, what would you advise him to tackle first? I mean, these are all major, much needed changes that I'm sure he has on his plate to make, but you have to approach things with, you can't do them all at the same time. Or maybe he can. What would you say, Orrin?
I would say the first thing that absolutely has to happen is shutting down the border. That needs to be a very serious priority. It's what he campaigned on originally. It's one of the things that propelled him to the top of the Republican Party. It is currently being used as a weapon. Open borders are being used as a weapon to transform our country and permanently change the reality of our voting system to make sure that the left will stay in power in perpetuity. If you don't shut that border down now, you're going to have a devastating consequence. Also, we've seen that the idea of mass deportations are increasingly popular across both parties, amazingly, and that needs to be something that enters into the conversation. I think that self deportation, by removing the incentives of illegals to stay here, can do a large amount of that work for us. I don't think you actually need to bus a lot of people across the border if you go ahead and tax remittances, if you go ahead and impose e-verify, if you go ahead and take simple actions to cut off welfare and other things to the people who are currently here, they will go ahead and move themselves back to their countries of origin. But that needs to be part of the agenda when he steps into office.
Yeah, I could think of a few things. I'm always here on the program talking about problems that could be solved by a committee of moms and dads at the PTO level. Because I mean, you'd be amazed at what parents do in their kids' schools with very little resources. You named off a few things there. I think one thing is you cut off all of these free debit cards, the debit cards that were given to them at the border, the ones they're currently using in Illinois and California and New York. And then obviously, e-verify and those things help, but offering one-way tickets back to your country of origin, flown on whichever airline you would like. I mean, I think people would leave in droves if they know not only am I unable to be hired to work here, free housing, I no longer have a free debit card, I can't eat for free, I can't stay in shelter. That's going to make a huge difference in whether or not people decide to stay here. And I would like to suggest something. I don't know what you're going to think about it, but I think as a incentive, we need to change the southern border and move it further across the Rio Grande. So the Rio Grande, both banks would be within the contiguous United States. And then that way we wouldn't have waterway to try to fence or manage as an entry point into the southern part of the country. And I know that's saying a lot. I mean, that's changing a country's border, but they're already in the process of changing our border because it's wide open.
It's true. We don't really have a border. The border is just a line on the map. It's not anything that's actually being enforced at the moment. I do think you're right that there are geographical challenges with enforcing border control right now, but ultimately, it's really a question of will. I think that if we simply had the will to go ahead and create the very incentives you're talking about for self deportation, if we were to go ahead and create a physical barrier, man it with a real staff that's actually turning people away, they're not sitting there vetting fake asylum submissions, but they're actually turning people away, refusing the drug cartels, refusing the human traffickers. I think ultimately this would be a problem that's very easy to solve.
Yeah, it is. And we've seen it. I mean, I think President Trump attempted to have immigration reform in his first term, and he was met with resistance by Republicans, which was a shock for him. And he began to look at what he could do through executive orders. But then he also realized we had good laws on the books already. Remain in Mexico, the MPP, that was already existing law that he simply said, I have an executive order. We're going to use this law. We're actually going to use American law that's already been passed by previous legislations or legislators to get this problem fixed. And then the other issue I think we really have to look at is this idea of birthright citizenship that extends to people who are not citizens of this country. My husband and I cannot go to Germany or Italy or Great Britain and have a baby and have that baby be a citizen of the UK. The baby that we have would be a citizen of whatever country we're citizens of, and we have to return to that in the United States as well. As we close out here, any last thought?
No, absolutely. That horrific reading of the 14th Amendment and the assignment of birthright citizenship is an absolute disaster. That's never what that amendment was meant to do. It was meant to solve the issue of whether former slaves were citizens. It was never meant to just simply give citizenship to anyone who happens to cross the border and have a child at that moment. And the fact that the left have perverted that the courts have perverted the reading of the original 14th Amendment to mean what it means now is terrible, and it's destroying the nation.
It is. Orrin McIntyre, author of The Total State: How Liberal Democracies Become Tyrannies. That's a good summer read, available wherever books are sold. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And is there stunning new research that proves an actual Bible story is true? I'll tell you more after this.